Welcome to this interview with Nathan Empsall. I'm Jimmy Reeder, a writer and speaker and founder of Imagine, a new learning community working for a compassionate world. The Reverend Nathan Empsall, an Episcopal priest and organizer, leads Faithful America as its executive director. It is, they say, the largest online community of Christians putting faith into action for social justice. Their members, Catholic, Protestant, and more, refuse to sit quietly while Jesus' message of good news is hijacked by the religious right to serve a hateful political agenda. They are organizing the faithful to challenge Christian nationalism and white supremacy and to renew the church's prophetic role in building a more free and just society. I met Nathan this past summer while working together to oppose the Reawaken America tour, originally scheduled for Rochester, New York, where I live, and then canceled but moved to nearby Batavia, was in the national news spotlight. So I'm delighted to have him here for this interview. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you, Jimmy. It's great to connect again.
I've said just a little about you, probably in your own words from your website, of course, but please tell us more about yourself and your work. What's most important to you?
Love is most important to me. So I'm the executive director of Faithful America, which is, as you said, a Christian online advocacy organization. And we've been at it since 2004 in various different iterations, fully independent 501c4 now for the last several years. And we like to say that our members, nearly 200,000 strong, are reclaiming Christianity from the religious right and Christian nationalism for love, dignity, and social justice. And that these days means two things. Mostly means taking on Christian nationalism, calling out the religious right for its distortion of our faith, calling out Christian nationalism by name for hijacking religion to seize power for itself and those like its adherents. I mean, power is important. It's how we change the world, but we have to share it, whereas Christian nationalism tries to seize power only for its adherents and those like them. But at the same time, while you're against something, you have to be for something. And so Faithful America is always excited to collaborate with partners. We're a Christian organization, but we'll work with interfaith, multi-faith, and secular partners too for the common good, for our shared values. And that means standing up for LGBTQ equality, standing up for God's creation, fighting climate change, helping immigrants and refugees. We did a lot of work early in the pandemic around a just response to COVID-19. And we do this in society and in the church. So we look at the politicians who hijack our faith, like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Michael Flynn, but we also, Doug Mastriano, the list goes on, but we also look at those in the church who kind of like the religious leaders of Jesus's day, saddling up to Pontius Pilate and Rome, who is distorting their position as a faith leader to prop up the corrupted politicians to gain access to power at the expense of the church. And that's, I would say, primarily within white evangelicalism and certain conservative Catholic corners, but it affects mainline Protestantism too. So we say that's not what Jesus calls us to be. That's not what Jesus calls us to do. We'll take on the Franklin Grahams of the world by name while also lifting up an alternative vision of love. We're small, but I think we punch above our weight. And all our victories are grassroots driven. All our funding comes from our members, from individual donations. And it's that way, working together as a community, that we got Jim Bakker's the televangelist show taken off several televangelist TV networks after he was selling a COVID-19 snake oil very early in the pandemic. We have helped pass pro-LGBTQ legislation, speaking up in that regard. We've stopped Islamophobic nominees in the Senate. We've helped free asylum seekers from jail. A lot of these victories, when we take on the religious right, it's often Faithful American members speaking out together. And when we make a difference for the common good and for policy, it's often working with our partners across broad coalitions. All for love.
Doing some great work. So for this brief interview, how would you then describe Christian nationalism and maybe the larger authoritarian movement that it's a part of?
Yeah, that's a really good point, that it is its own movement, and it is cousins to many others, part of something even broader. Christian nationalism is a political ideology. It is a distortion of religion. It uses religious symbols and language, but at its heart, it is not religion, it is politics. It is a political ideology that merges the Christian identity with the civic identity to basically say you are only a true American if you're a good Christian, and a very specific kind of Christian at that,
Right.
usually a right-wing conservative Christian, mostly evangelical, but Catholics too, mostly white, but individual people of color are allowed in if they will adhere to that cultural whiteness and to that political view. And the goal so to saying you can only be a good American if you're a good conservative Christian, you can only be a good Christian if you hold our conservative American politics, really merging those things to the single goal is to seize power, seize power for members of this movement and for people like themselves, politically, culturally. This is why you see Franklin Graham claiming that progressive Christianity can send you to hell, why you see Tony Perkins and others in the movement basically pretending their only critics are atheists, ignoring the large coalitions of Christians that oppose Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
They want to remake the church and state in their own image, and even claim that church and state aren't separate, that they, driven by David Barton at Wall Builders, a pseudo-historian, they propagate this false view of the Constitution that says there is no separation of church and state, that the state needs to stay out of the church, but the church should guide the state, which leads to that hallmark Christian nationalist phrase, America is a Christian nation. And they are seeking to take rights away from people different than them, especially from non-Christians, from Jews, from Muslims, from atheists, but also from people of color. Look at their attacks on voting rights, from women, certainly from the LGBTQ community. It's all about seizing power just for themselves, rather than sharing power in a vision of equality, compassion, and justice for all.
Yeah, very good. I know people go to your website at Faithful America. They'll find a lot of other resources about Christian nationalism, links to a whole variety of places. So I encourage people listening here to do that as well. The most frequent question I get as people learn more about all of this is, so what can we do? What can I do? The movement uses fear to drive people, but what people really need is hope, and that requires some kind of action in that direction. So, what do you think people can do to challenge this movement?
The first thing is to not lose hope, which is very hard, but to keep going every day, just on that personal level. Find kindness, share kindness, give kindness. It might change the world in a tiny, tiny way, but more importantly, it will keep you from changing so that you can stay grounded and do the work. Before we do this work, we've got to ground ourselves in Jesus, in kindness, in love, in grace. Otherwise, we get beat down. We're recording this interview in early January, so we just had Advent. Technically, it's still Christmas for 2 more days as we record this interview. It's the 10th day, 11th day of Christmas. And that's a time when we remember light in the darkness. And we've got to hold on to that light because we're heading into the darkness of January and February. And, we have the big festive at the beginning of winter. But hold on to that light and that hope always. And then when you start to do the work, I mean, that's the real question. What does the work look like? We find ways to share that hope with others. We find ways to create the beloved community, as people say, whoa, I don't recognize what's happening as the teachings of Jesus. I'm out. We've got to give them a place to land, we've got to lift that up. I think that there have been churches and communities grounded in love and hope for a long time, but they don't, I hate to say this, advertise themselves. We've got to make ourselves known so that people know we're here when they're looking for us. People don't always find these things randomly. That's why so many churches are shrinking. But just as we need to lift up love and hope and grace and compassion and equality and dignity and mercy, it is also vital that we name the problem, that we learn what it looks like in our community, and that we take it on head on, sometimes even naming names. And to name names, I mean, you want to do so lovingly, the way Jesus would take on the religious leaders of his day, still, calling them hypocrites, calling them a brood of vipers, yet having dinner in their homes. Christian nationalism is not Christian, but Christian nationalists as people are if they say they are. Who am I to question their faith? Who are they to question mine? So we have to, I don't want to call it a battle, but we do have to identify, and that means starting with education. So, okay, let me finally get to the answer you thought you were looking for. We have a tab at faithfulamerica.org, upper right-hand corner of the page says Christian nationalism, talks about some of the things we're talking about, and then provides a lot of resources. We didn't create these. We're just trying to collect them from all the friends and partners we know who are already creating them. We've done a few webinars you can watch. but we'll direct you to great curriculums from Christians Against Christian Nationalism, such an important resource that's been endorsed by Lutheran and Episcopal presiding bishops, multiple Baptist, Presbyterian leaders, Catholic activists, etc. They have a great curricula you can use in your church. Vote Common Good, our friends over there, have another one. I know Doug Paget has spoken with you, and his staff has pulled together a similar curriculum. I encourage people to use these curriculums, which have video elements, reading elements, in your church, not just alone. In adult form, in adult Sunday school, at a special Wednesday night gathering, whatever looks right in your context,
Mhm.
and learn what Christian nationalism looks like and where you might find it in your community, but certainly even in your own church. Is the 4th of July prayer making America too much of a Christian nation? Is the flag just as revered as the altar? Little things like that, that in and of themselves may not hurt anyone, but make us get a little too used to it. So we start to not recognize it when it creeps into policy, when it starts to hurt people and hurt democracy, as we saw. The worst case so far, but it continues, is January 6th, but also in theocratic legislation that strips rights away from people, often in Jesus's name. We start to get used to the rhetoric that builds up to that legislation because of the baby versions we hear in our own church. Learn to recognize that, and then find places where it exists in your community, organize, get involved, go to school board meetings, go to county council, city council meetings. That's what the right is doing, and that's why they're passing legislation to transform our schools, whether that's changing the textbooks, banning masks during peak COVID, whatever it may be. They're showing up, and they're showing up in Jesus's name. Now, the left may show up, but we often leave our faith at home, so then it looks like this battle between secular atheists and the only Christians in town. We need to show up, and we need to say, I'm here because of my faith, but I'm not here to shove my faith on you. My faith tells me to love everyone, and that's why we have to have this policy, not that policy. You're not saying God says this and I will force you to follow my religion. You're saying, we are here for love, and we're here for all our neighbors. Let's do this together. Show up with that message. I don't think we're showing up enough. Sometimes showing up is hard. You can stay home. I fully encourage you to go to faithfulamerica.org. We do a lot of petition work. We'll also do call alerts, other action alerts, social media actions, all the online tools and steps you can think of. But take action on our petitions. One of the things that we are really focused on is the spread of misinformation, especially, but not just when done in Jesus's name. And there are victories here. If you're looking for hope, OAN is one of the worst of the worst. 20 steps to the right of Fox News, intentionally spreading misinformation about democracy, January 6th, voting, and COVID, among other things. And they have been removed from Verizon and DirecTV, partly for financial reasons, but partly because of consumer pressure. And so we look, right now, it seems that conservatives and the religious right and Christian nationalism, they're not on CNN anymore. They're not in the newspapers anymore. They've built their own media empire. But that media empire still depends on Amazon Web Services or local radio stations, or on Comcast Cable, on Amazon.com. It still uses the basic tech and corporate infrastructure to get into your home. So they've changed channels, they've changed media mediums, but they haven't changed the underlying platform. So corporate pressure, get at those brands that care about their brand name and don't want to be associated with eroding democracy or taking away rights, and point out, well, that's what you're doing by hosting this channel. So Faithful America does a lot of that work. We also speak out for LGBTQ rights when the church attacks them, or when, I should say, segments of the church. So visit us at faithfulamerica.org. And the last thing I'll say here, again, stay active in your own community. I pointed to OAN's defeats as a source of hope, but the other point, Jim, you alluded to this in Rochester, was the way you and other local activists put enough consumer pressure on the Armory, the venue that was going to host Reawaken America tour, and they canceled. And yes, Michael Flynn's megachurch tour rescheduled at a church almost an hour away. The event still happened, but it was smaller. It wasn't downtown. The MC was caught, the organizer was caught in a number of lies as he tried to reschedule. It was a blow to their event. It was a blow to their movement. And even though they still had their event, it was not as successful and did not have quite the impact it otherwise would have, thanks to people standing together locally, many of them doing so because of their faith. So we do see these victories when we speak up, when we take action. It starts at the local level. That's the only thing I'll agree with Michael Flynn on. Local action takes a big difference. And so those of us sitting in national chairs and national orgs can only tell you so much, because really you have to know what's happening in your area. And as newsrooms shrink, it's harder and harder to find that out. But team up with others, other churches, others in your church, and figure it out and just get involved locally. Do what you can online and then take that offline.
Oh, a lot of great ideas. Thank you so much. Just one other question, but first, a little background to prepare for the question. Leaders of this larger movement have spent 50 years trying or learning how to craft a specific narrative that sounds like common sense to people who have heard it repeated so often. It's all they hear. And what the message is, they want people to take back America, return to a time when most of the privilege and power in this country belonged to people like them. They don't say that, of course, but that's what they mean. And a lot of people in this country were left out of that kind of world. So we need to develop an alternative narrative so we can persuade more people to build the kind of world we want to live in, one of empathy and compassion. So, given that background and your own experience, how do you think we can do that?
I think in a lot of ways we already have the narrative itself.
Okay.
Uh, and there are two sides to that narrative for different communities. One is to say, we all believe this. No matter what your race, your religion, your zip code, your gender, you should have equal rights and be free to pursue a good life for you and your family. And I think we all believe that. We may disagree on what it looks like, which is why it's so important to name the things that disrupt or corrupt that vision or that faith, because we all say we love the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but you've got Carrie Lake, the election denying candidate for governor in Arizona, claiming MLK would have been a member of MAGA. And of course, Dr. King's daughter took that on Twitter and said, no way. But everyone claims to love Dr. King now because of that one little clip from one speech, I Have a Dream, judged by the content of your character. It's everyone says, oh yeah, of course that, we all love that, and then ignores the rest of his work, the letter from the Birmingham jail, his opposition to Vietnam. So we have to be specific about what actually we stand for and who and what violates that. And I think that liberals, well, I'll say that in a second, but the other piece of our message of the quality narrative is Jesus. The right talks a lot about, well, quite frankly, about Paul, but they talk a lot about the Bible. They do talk about faith more and more. They're not reading the Bible before talking about it, and they're just talking politics and wrapping it up in the Bible. But Jesus is awesome. Jesus' radical message of inclusion and love, the people he met and brought in, no one was excluded. Uh, when the crowd wants to stone a prostitute who's violating all the laws, he says, well, those among you who are without sin, cast the first stone. When he uses Samaritans as the good people in his story, those were the outcasts of the time, the people who were gross, and stay away from them. Whoever you might think of that, the homeless person asking you for money is the person Jesus wants at the table. No one, rich or poor, is ever excluded. He brought together the wise men and the shepherds, these wealthy kings and the smelly guys on the outskirts of town, right from the very start. And that is a message that resonates and that people love. And I think that, I love my Jewish and Muslim friends and I want to work with them. And I'm not going to tell anyone they're going to hell for not believing the way I do. I want them to talk about their beliefs. And we Christians need to talk about our beliefs too. And I think that because we live in pluralistic, multi-faith cultures, and because we don't want to sound like the religious right and its hatred, we don't talk enough about Jesus. But you look at, and Jesus's message of love, well, you look at presiding Bishop Michael Curry in my own Episcopal church, we're one of the more liberal denominations and also God's frozen chosen. Sometimes we joke about ourselves. But he's bringing in this message of love, of a liberating, loving, life-giving God, calling the church the Jesus movement, and our denomination is just one branch of it. When we talk about Jesus, people sit up, they listen. It's not about hellfire, it's not about going to hell, it's about love and inclusion. That's not a message that all liberals should have, and it's not a message I'm asking you to push on non-Christians, but that's how we identify who we are and why we do what we do. And I think that when we stop hiding that, we are more of our authentic selves. We are more loving. We give people a place to land. And it does show that, oh my gosh, Christianity doesn't have to look like this. It's the religious right gets their power. Christian nationalism gets their power from claiming to have a monopoly on Christianity. We will chip away at their power and restore the beloved community when we speak for our faith authentically rather than hiding it or just using it as a motivating factor only, but then staying to policy arguments. That's the other thing. I think that so we have a message. We talk about no matter who you are, where you're born in America, you have a right to pursue freedom and equality with your family. We talk about Jesus. I think though, as liberals, one of the successes that religious right has, and one of the things that the broader authoritarian movement knows, is that people are busy and they're not going to spend a lot of time researching or diving into the facts. Someone who's got 3 kids, 2 jobs, they don't have time. Hey, one job, one kid, you're still exhausted by the end of the day. I know, she's 3. I'm perpetually exhausted. And so you just collapse on the couch, rot your brain with The Simpsons for half an hour, go to bed. Or 4 hours of binging on Netflix and you go to bed without enough sleep. It's hard to pursue the facts, and we don't have time for that. And so earlier I said, hey, here's some great curricula. You don't have to wait until you've gone through any sort of course or read lengthy articles to take action, because you know what's wrong in your life. You know what's wrong in your community, and you have a sense of what you need to fix it, or at least of, if not how to get to the solution, what it ultimately will look like once things are fixed. So it's time to speak out now. And I think we as liberals don't do that. And when we do speak, we want to be experts. We want to educate ourselves in all the facts first. And then when we do speak, we try to put together 20, 30 facts. I think it's really important that we be grounded in fact, just as we're grounded in faith. Both my parents are scientists. I have a master's degree in environmental management, with a healthy dose of science courses there. That matters. But when we're actually messaging our narrative, people are going to listen for 3 or 4 sentences, and they're going to know if it feels right. Like you said, Jimmy, the authoritarian movement talks about common sense. And I don't want to use that phrase in my own messaging, but it needs to feel right to people, or they're going to say, that's not right. I'm moving on. I'm too busy for this. So we have to think about, how are we making people feel? And it doesn't mean manipulating emotions in a negative way, but it does mean saying, I want you to feel empowered, feel loved, and feel ready to love once you've heard this 3 or 4 sentence message. And I'm rambling on and on when here I'm saying we need to be brief and get to love right. That what I just said, that paragraph, is maybe the only thing I should have said right at the start. I'll give you one example though from we were talking about the Reawaken America tour. The host, MC, and organizer of this tour, a fellow by the name of Clay Clark, who teaches that the COVID-19 vaccine is Jeffrey Epstein's DNA merged with Bill Gates's nanotechnology. Luciferin is the name of the technology. It's Lucifer is right there in the name. And that they're injecting it into our bodies to create a new transhuman species. And I'm not making this up. He preached, you find the video on Rumble, which is the conservative YouTube. He gives this talk at every Reawaken America tour. He blames it all on the World Economic Forum that meets in Davos, all the rich guys and columnists who get together to talk policy. And anyway, when he gives this presentation, the point I'm making is he puts on a screen behind him this giant list of like 100 sources, and they're all tiny font. And he says, go to our website, you can look up all the facts, you have all these links, all these books. No one does that. And it's a terrible it's just a badly formatted website that's really hard to use. Even if I agreed with them, I'd say, do better, man. They're not trying to do better. They're not trying to get you to look at these citations, because half the citations are bogus, dead links, or a single distorted sentence in a paragraph in an article that isn't what they're saying at all. But the audience sees this and they go, whoa, look at this. We're doing our research. We feel smart with this. This is, oh, he knows what he's talking about. And they feel smart. And they think they're listening to someone smart, and they feel empowered. Do not copy what Clay Clark is doing, but note that is how they are manipulating emotions to make people feel informed when they're not. And people leave. They don't go out because they're informed. They go out because of how they feel. How can we do that in an honest and ethical way? Inform people briefly, make them feel, actually root ourselves in fact, but make them feel informed and loved and empowered. We already have the narrative. How do we get people to accept it? It's more about how you communicate the narrative, I think, than what the narrative is. So the narrative is love and equality.
We've come to the end of our time. I think that's an excellent place just to end this. There's a lot here for people to reflect on and to take action on. So, Nathan, thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you, Jimmy, for all you're doing.